part 3 of Hitchhiking. By the way, I got a new toy this week, which allows me to control my slideshow. But look, I got a laser beam too. And if I want to, I can make the screen go black. It's very cool. But today I want to share with you first some things that you may not know about Sir Alfred. The first one is really surprising, kind of shocking to people. Alfred Hitchcock is, of course, probably the most revered, most honored, most imitated director of the 20th century. And yet, he never got one of these. He was nominated 6 times for Best Director, but he never won. He even directed a movie that won Best Picture, and he didn't get Best Director that year. His movies, though, were nominated for more than 40 Academy Awards over the years and won several. He just never won a Director's Award. They gave him a special award toward the end of his life, the Irving Thalberg Award, but he never won an Oscar. Isn't that amazing? And there's kind of a lesson, when you think about it, to be learned there. It's not the prizes you win, it's the work that you do. And if I'd thought of that earlier, I would have put that on the screen, because that'll preach right there. It's not how much recognition you get in this life, it's the work that you leave and the legacy that you leave behind. So he never won an Oscar, but in spite of that, he left us these 59 movies which have some awesome things in them. Some things you may not know about Hitchcock. Did you know he made a comedy? Now, I've talked to several people who have seen this just recently. It's called The Trouble with Harry. And it's a comedy, but of course it's Hitchcock, so it's kind of a dark comedy. The story of Harry, this is Harry laying down here. Harry is dead when the movie starts and remains dead throughout the movie. And it's in this New England little country town, village, and he's found dead, and 3 different people think, oh, I think I might have done something that caused Harry's death. And so it's kind of a comedy of errors, because these 3 people that think they might have caused his death keep hiding the body so they won't be found, and then somebody else will stumble across it and say, oh, did I cause this? I better hide Harry's body. And so they move him around all over the place. So it's an interesting little movie. It's not his best by any means, but it's a different kind of tone. And this movie is noteworthy because it was the very first movie of this lady, at least in this life. Shirley MacLaine's first movie was The Trouble with Harry. Now, there was another young actor in the movie. It was not his first movie. He was a pro by the time this movie was made, even though he was a little tiny guy. This is 2 years before he will become Theodore Cleaver, the Beaver. He started acting when he was 2 years old, and he's still around. Jerry Mathers, long-lived career. Those are 2 noteworthy things about The Trouble with Harry. Did you know that Hitchcock made a 3D movie? In the 50s, and this happens about every 20 years, Hollywood decides that 3D is the latest thing. This is the way all movies are going to be. They did it in the 50s, they did it in the 70s, and they've done it just recently in past years. Like a year and a half or 2 years ago, it looked like everything was going to be 3D from that point on. I think that's fading away because they're realizing we don't want to wear those glasses, and it doesn't really matter if I can reach out and touch somebody on screen or not. But Hitchcock in the mid-50s made a 3D movie called Dial M for Murder. Features Grace Kelly at her most beautiful, one of her earlier roles. Ray Milland plays her husband. And the story of Dial M for Murder, Ray Milland has hired a guy to kill his wife, Grace Kelly. And so while she's alone in their nice house, this guy breaks into the house and attacks her and is trying to strangle her, and he leans her over to the top of the desk and is choking her, and she's reaching out frantically for anything that she can find to defend herself. Now, Hitchcock didn't use 3D like most people did in the 50s. He didn't constantly throw things at you out of the screen where you're ducking and things like that. He only used the effect really a handful of times. But one of them was in this scene where Grace Kelly is being strangled, and she reaches out wildly on the desk behind her, and her hand finds a pair of scissors. And she grabs the scissors, and she sticks them in the guy's back. So she ends up killing the guy that was going to kill her. But this is one of those places where Hitchcock used 3D very effectively, because she's grasping around trying to save her life, and her hand comes right out in your face and feels around, and those scissors are right there, this close to you. It's very cool. What else? What else do you not know about Hitchcock? I read this week he was on a trip to France one time, and he was at the border, and he ran into a rather snooty French customs officer, and the officer looked at his passport and says, "It says here you are a producer. What do you produce?" And Hitchcock said, "Goosebumps," which is a good line. I want to talk to you today about some recurring themes. Hitchcock had certain subjects, certain feelings, certain motifs that he returned to over and over and over again. One of them, which I mentioned a few times in previous weeks, was the icy blonde. He had a real thing for icy blondes. And he cast them as the leads in his movies for virtually the last half of his career. Almost all of them were blondes, and he wanted them to be sort of aloof. He believed that blondes were aloof. He believed that brunettes were sexier. So you can come down on whichever side of the fence you want to be on there. But he believed that blondes were distant. And so he believed that by using them as the heroines in his movies, that they became this sort of unapproachable goddess type character. And when he started, I mean, Grace Kelly is not unapproachable, you know. Grace Kelly is not off-putting. You don't look at Grace Kelly and say, "I bet she's terrible to be around." Right, guys? But then he remade his own movie called The Man Who Knew Too Much with Jimmy Stewart and Doris Day. In fact, in that movie, Doris Day sings "Que Sera, Sera," which would become her lifelong theme song. It's from a Hitchcock movie. Isn't that weird? She's not as icy as some later actresses in Hitchcock movies, but she's a little bit distant. She's not the warm, outgoing person you might expect from Doris Day if you've seen other Doris Day movies. Then Kim Novak, mostly unknown actress named Tippi Hedren in The Birds. Now, she is the epitome of the icy blonde, and he used her in a couple of movies after The Birds because he liked that type. He had a thing for icy blondes. We won't go too far into that right now, but that's one theme we're not going to spend too much time on. One theme I do want to talk about in a little bit more depth, though, is Hitchcock's idea of the wrong man. Now, what do we mean by that? If you go back and watch a bunch of Hitchcock movies, you'll see time after time there's a character, and I'm usually the lead character, who is an innocent person, who hasn't done anything wrong, and yet something happens that causes that person to have to go on the run to avoid being arrested or killed, or just to try to clear his name. This happens in multiple Hitchcock movies. And you have to wonder why this resounded so strongly in his nature that he felt like most of his movies needed to have a person that qualified as the wrong man or the innocent accused person. It happens in a lot of films. Last week, I showed you a long clip from North by Northwest, the Cary Grant one with the airplane and the Mount Rushmore. You remember? You remember? I got in trouble for that. I posted that video to YouTube, and apparently I used too long a clip there, and I got a little notice that said this video violates copyright, and so it's a hidden video now. If you go to my Facebook, there's a link to it, you can go to it, but if you just search on YouTube, you can't find it now, but it's still there. It's just for you and me. Okay. So I can't use clips that long, apparently. They have some very sophisticated software that without a human even having to get involved knows when you've used too much. We saw last week how Cary Grant was chasing across the country from New York City all the way to South Dakota to where they had that chase on Mount Rushmore. Why was he running? Well, guys were after him. Spies were after him. Why? Well, it's all a case of mistaken identity. Here's the first part of that movie, very early on. Cary Grant plays an advertising executive who's very busy, very good at his job, very prestigious. He's leaving his office to go meet some other businessmen for lunch at a hotel, a restaurant and a hotel. But as he gets there, he remembers he's forgotten to do something. He was going to call his mother and tell her he could not make it to dinner that night. But he forgot to do it. So he decides, I'll just send her a telegram. Remember telegrams? I don't, but apparently they were a big thing at some point. He decides to send her a telegram, and that simple act will send him running for his life across the country. Not just from the bad guys, but also from the good guys. Running from the police as well as the spies who are out to get him. This is how that happens.
Good evening, Mr. Thornhill.
Good evening, Victor. I'm looking for Mr. Weltner and two other gentlemen.
Yes, sir. Right this way.
Coming? Ah, here. I'm a little late.
Roger Thornhill, Fanning Nelson.
How do you do?
How do you do? Larry Wade.
How do you do?
We got a little head start here, Mr. Thornhill.
Oh, that won't last long.
Spelling Larry and Fanning, you may be slow in starting, but there's nobody faster coming down the home stretch. What's the matter, Roger? You got the fidgets?
Oh, well, I just did something pretty stupid. I told my secretary to call Mother, and I realized she won't be able to reach her where she is.
Oh, why not?
Well, she's playing bridge at the apartment of one of her cronies.
Your secretary?
No, my mother. One of those brand new apartments, all wet paint and no telephone yet. Perhaps if I sent her a telegram.
Mr. George Kaplan.
Boy!
Kaplan.
I've got to get off a wire immediately. Could you send it for me if I write it out for you here?
Oh, I'm not permitted to do that, sir, but if you'll follow me.
Oh. Would you excuse me?
Okay, so you see what happened? You have to kind of pay attention to what's going on in the background there. Cary Grant decides he's going to send a telegram. Meanwhile, the bellboy is walking through the restaurant saying, George Kaplan, George Kaplan. He's paging this George Kaplan, whoever that is. And at the moment he does that, Cary Grant turns around and goes, boy. And these two guys are watching and they say, there's George Kaplan.
Hey, gentlemen.
Go right ahead.
Right through there, sir. Thank you, sir.
Hey, wait a minute. What's that supposed to be?
Car's waiting outside. You will walk between us, saying nothing.
What are you talking about?
Let's go.
Let's go where? Who are you?
Mere errand boys carrying concealed weapons. His is pointed at your heart. So please, no errors of judgment, I beg of you.
Oh, come on, fellas. What is this, a joke or something?
Yes, a joke. We will laugh in the car. Come.
Oh, this is ridiculous.
Yes, it's a joke. We will laugh in the car. And this is what starts this whole movie that sends him chasing across the country, just raising his hand in a restaurant at the wrong time. Be careful. Be vigilant. There are Russian spies everywhere. But that's not the only movie by any means that Hitchcock did this in. And he started it long before this. A movie called Saboteur. Hitchcock, I don't know why he did this. He made a movie called Saboteur. He also made a movie called Sabotage. They're two different movies. And it's very hard to remember which one you're talking about when you're talking about a particular one. Saboteur stars Robert Cummings, who you may recognize. Remember the TV show called Love That Bob? Good-looking young guy, but Hitchcock did not like him. He was thrust on Hitchcock. The studio said, here's who's going to be the leading man in your next picture. And Hitchcock had to do it at that point. He didn't have the clout to say, no, I don't want him. Later on, he would be able to choose his actors more specifically. So Robert Cummings plays a guy who works in a munitions factory during the war, during World War II, and there's a tremendous explosion because a fire starts and somebody has filled a fire extinguisher with gasoline. Yeah. And so when Robert Cummings tries to use the fire extinguisher, it ends up resulting in the death of one of his fellow workers in his munitions plant. And instantly everybody thinks it's an act of sabotage. And they think he is the saboteur. So he has to go on the run to try to find out who could have put gasoline in the fire extinguisher and what's going on. Who's behind this plot? So he goes on the run and things ensue as they always do in Hitchcock movies. At one point, he ends up handcuffed to a beautiful blonde woman. It could happen. And of course, at first she hates him. Guess what happens later, though? They kind of start to like each other after a while. But even this movie, which is 15 or 20 years before North by Northwest, Hitchcock had some themes that he did over and over again. Not just The Wrong Man, but in North by Northwest, do you remember that chase we looked at last week across the face of Mount Rushmore? He did something very similar way back in this World War II movie. What's another great monument in America you could use to do a chase on? Well, in this case, it's standing in New York Harbor. That's the Nazi who is behind the whole thing.
Come on, Fry.
This is no different from what any of us would do.
Don't you go over. If you slip, that'll be 3 gone. Quick, get a rope.
Can you get a grip with your feet? I can't.
Kane, I'm getting a rope.
They're getting a rope. Hold on, Fry.
I'll cling. I swear I will. I'll cling.
Hurry up with the rope.
Tell him quick. The sleeve. Sleeve!
And that's the end of the movie. You know, he likes to tie him up real quick at the end. That's how it ends. Bob Cummings is safe. The Nazi spy is dead. Liberty has won again. And the lesson to be learned here, don't buy your suits off the rack. Or maybe life is never what it seems. I'm sorry. I got carried away. But Hitchcock loved this theme of the wrong man so much that eventually, in the mid-50s, he made a movie called The Wrong Man, starring Henry Fonda. It's Henry Fonda's only Hitchcock film. And it's unusual also, it's another thing you may not know about Hitchcock, The Wrong Man is a true story. It's a true story that actually happened in New York City. And Hitchcock read the story and thought that would be perfect for me to make a film out of, because that's exactly the kind of story that appealed to him. And so he tells the story of the Henry Fonda character, who is a musician. He plays stand-up bass in a band, at the Stork Club in New York City. And they got the film in the actual Stork Club. And I actually think he must have learned how to play the bass, because if you watch it, he's right on the money, what he's doing there. We see this guy, we get introduced to this guy. He works late. He works until this nightclub closes, which is well after 2 in the morning. And so then he goes to an all-night diner and has something to eat. And then he gets on a train and heads home. And then he gets off the train and onto a bus that takes him to the end of the block where his house is. And he walks down the block and he picks up the milk bottles on the front porch and unlocks the door and goes inside. And he has a beautiful wife, played by Vera Miles. He has 2 young boys who are just great kids, both of them musical, both of them he teaches how to play music. It's a perfect little family, except there's not enough money. Who hasn't had that problem? There's never enough money, and the wife is always worried about it. Vera Miles is always worried about it. And now she says, my teeth are killing me. I have this problem with my teeth. And he says, did you go to the dentist? She said, yeah. He says it's going to cost $300 to fix my teeth. And he says, well, we'll just do it. She says, where are we going to get $300? He said, we'll borrow it. She said, we're always borrowing stuff. He says, well, we always pay it back. She said, yeah, but it seems like we're always just on the edge. If I was only a better manager, this wouldn't happen. If only we could get ahead a little bit. Where are we going to get $300? And Henry Fonda says, well, we can borrow against your life insurance policy. He says, we've already borrowed against mine, but we haven't touched yours, so I'll take the policy by the insurance office tomorrow and ask them what kind of loan we can get against the value of your policy. It might pay all of the dental bill, or at least a good part of it. She says, okay, smoochy, smoochy. So the next day, this guy who has a nice, steady job for a musician, a steady job, and a nice family, innocently goes into the insurance office with a copy of his wife's insurance policy to find out what kind of loan he can get. What he does not know is that this office has been held up at gunpoint recently by a man who looks a whole lot like Henry Fonda, apparently. Because when he walks in, nobody seems very happy to see him. And Hitchcock is always messing with the audience. We know this movie is called The Wrong Man. We know it's about an innocent guy. What's the shot? He's behind. He's coming up to the teller cage, but look, already he's behind bars. Uh-oh.
I wonder if you'd look at this policy for me and tell me how much we can borrow on it.
Rose Balestro?
Yes, that's my wife.
I wonder, could you wait a minute while I check on something?
Yes, I'll wait.
Don't look all at one time.
I didn't hear you.
I think the man at the window is the one that's been here before. I'm sure of it.
There's another lady in the office who is terrified because she apparently was working at the counter when the robbery happened. They say, you need to look at this guy. And she says, I can't look over there. I don't even want to look at him. I'm going to faint. And they say, you have to look at him. She finally takes a glance over there and says, that's him. Well, they don't do anything right then. The lady takes his policy back to the window and says, yes, you can probably get this loan, but your wife is going to have to come in too. So he says, all right, we'll come back in a day or two. Puts the policy back in his hand, leaves, goes home, gets ready for work, goes to the club, plays that night till 2 or 3 in the morning, does the same routine, goes to have dinner, gets on the train, gets on the bus. Bus stops at the end of his block, and he walks up the sidewalk to his door as he does every night. But this night, something different happens.
Hey, Chris.
Your name, Chris?
You calling me?
Your name, Christopher Emmanuel Ballestero?
Yes, it is.
We want to speak to you. We're police officers.
What about?
We'd like you to come down to the precinct and help us out.
I'm just getting home. I'd like to tell my wife if I'm going anyplace.
Well, you better come along and tell her later.
Where is it?
110th precinct.
Won't take long.
Shouldn't take long.
I'd like to tell my wife.
It's all right, Chris. Just a routine matter. Down to the precinct, we'll tell you about it.
Now, while most Hitchcock movies are fun to watch just because of the way he films them and directs them, this movie is the opposite of fun. It is grim, it is depressing, it is frightening, because this character that Henry Fonda plays, his life changes at this moment. They show in great detail how he's taken to the police station and fingerprinted and photographed, and he's stood up in a lineup, and these women from the insurance place say, yes, number 4, he's the one. And then he's locked away in a cell. And one thing I had not thought about before I did some research on this movie this week, this was in 1955 that the film was made. This was before the Miranda decision. Now, we take that for granted now. You know what the Miranda decision is? The Miranda decision is required by law. When police stop you, they have to tell you what's going on. If they arrest you, they have to tell you what you're being arrested for. They have to give you the right to make a phone call, the right to have a lawyer present when they question you. This was before that happened, and Henry Fonda gets none of that. They take him downtown, they book him, and they put him in a cell, and he doesn't even know what he's supposed to have done. They humiliate him because they automatically assume this is the guy. They've got positive identification. They humiliate him. They take him to 2 other stores and say, we want you to walk into this store. Don't say anything. Just walk in to the back, turn around, and walk out. And he walks in these stores and comes out, and then the cops go in and ask the employees, is that the guy that held you up? And they say, yeah. And so he is accused of 3 armed robberies, and he's done nothing. And now he finds himself locked up, sitting in a cell with no way to even get word to his wife of where he is. Now, I don't know if that scares you. It scares me because I have been the wrong man. I stopped at a stop sign one day several years ago. I had an expired inspection sticker on my car. I knew I did. I was stalling, putting it off. A policeman turned right in front of me and saw that sticker and turned on his lights. And I thought, oh man, I'm going to have to pay that ticket. It's probably going to be $150. So I sat there, I gave him my license. He went back to his car, and then a few minutes later he came back and said, would you step out of the car? I said, what's the problem? He said, there's a warrant out for your arrest. Took me out of the car, frisked me, handcuffed me, put me in the back seat of his police cruiser. 45 minutes later, they put me back in the car, handcuffed again, and drove me to the Travis County Correctional Facility downtown. And there, I was photographed, I was fingerprinted. They took away my watch, my ring, my money, my wallet, my belt, my shoes, my clothes. They gave me an orange jumpsuit and a pair of rubber slippers to wear. And they locked me in a cell. And I was there for 27 hours. And oh, they said, you can make a phone call. There's a phone right there. there's a payphone on the wall. You can only make a collect call, and you don't even get to talk to whoever answers the phone. Instead, when somebody answers the phone, they hear a recording that says, "Will you accept a collect call from the Travis County Correctional Facility?" I don't know what you would do if you got that call out of the blue. I was also hampered by the fact I didn't know anybody's phone number. Even my wife's. She was speed dial number 1. And so there was a phone book there. It looked like it had been there for 15 years, and every other page had been ripped out of it. The yellow pages where the attorney listings were was just torn to bits. I tried to find a lawyer that I knew to call. Nobody would accept that call. And folks, you want to talk about feeling alone. I sat in this little metal cell with a thin little blanket, and it was freezing cold in there. And I sat there 27 hours, fully aware that there was not a person in the universe who knew where I was. I picture what my daughter must be thinking if she even was told about it or even knew what was going on. There was no way for me to get word to anybody. And periodically, they would let me out of the cell into the common area for a meal. Always at the strangest hours. Breakfast, 4:30 a.m. Here's your breakfast. They hand you a brown paper bag that had an apple and some cookies. Packaged cookies. I couldn't eat a thing. My mouth was so dry, I couldn't swallow anything. I was by far the oldest person in there. I was the only person of my particular ethnicity in there. And I'm sure all of them wondered, what's this old guy in for? You know what I was in for? I was in there for a clerical error. When my wife finally found out where I was released the next afternoon after 27 hours there. I walked out of there. I did not have to pay a penny in bail. I never had to hire a lawyer. I never had to appear in court. The whole thing was a mistake. Now, what do you do in a situation like that? You got nothing to do but think. They wouldn't give me anything to read. No newspaper, not even a Bible. They wouldn't give me anything. And I sat there with this cheap blanket wrapped around me on the edge of this uncomfortable steel bunk. And I thought, what am I going to do? It gives you great clarity. It gives you great focus when you think, nobody knows where I am and I could be here forever. What keeps you going? I did a lot of praying that night. I did some singing that night too. I was still singing in the choir at that point. We had a musical coming up, and just to pass the time, I thought, I'm going to sing that whole thing, every song I can remember. It was 2004. Brian Wilson had just put out the Smile album after 47 years. I sat there and sang through the whole Smile album in my head just to see if I could do it all in the right order. Just to try to stay sane. I can't imagine being in there for longer than that. And I will tell you, it was for me a life-changing experience because I was the wrong man. I wasn't guilty, but there I was. Well, Henry Fonda's character in this movie, that's why this movie just kills me to watch. It just makes me almost sick to my stomach because things just go so badly. Somebody in his family is finally able to scrape up enough bail to get him out of jail so he can go home and so he can go back to work and at least keep working until he can find a lawyer until time for his trial. But his wife starts really going downhill. She gets extremely depressed. She gets to where she can hardly talk. And she begins to blame herself for the way things have gone. And he tells her, no, it's not your fault at all. There's nothing you could have done differently. But she just loses it, and eventually she has to be put in a sanitarium. he's able to get a lawyer, and the lawyer at first says, man, I don't know, this is going to be tough. But Henry Fonda says, I know at least one of those dates that a store was robbed. I wasn't even here. I was playing a gig at a country club out in the country. And so the lawyer says, well, you need to find somebody who can remember you being there. And he goes to this country club and looks around and finds people and finds out the names of 3 of the guests that were there that he can remember. And then he sets about trying to find where those 3 guests are. And guess what? 2 of them have died. And remember, this is a true story. This is exactly how it happened. And so it comes time to start the trial, and it's not looking good. They put those women from the insurance office on the stand. And the district attorney says, do you see the man that robbed you at gunpoint? And they say, yes. And he doesn't just say, would you point him out? He says, would you go put your hand on his shoulder? And so they walk over and put their hand on Henry Fonda's shoulder. This movie keeps up this grim feeling for an hour and 35 minutes. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is horrible, this poor guy. And at an hour and 35 minutes, very close to the end of the movie's only an hour and 40 minutes, very close to the end of the movie, there's an interesting scene that happens between him and his mother.
None of it is your fault, Manny. You've just had a lot of bad breaks that can happen to anybody.
Yeah, what can I do?
Have you prayed?
Yes.
What did you pray for?
I prayed for help.
Pray for strength, Manny.
I don't see how anything can help if I don't get ever be suspected for anything he committed in our neighborhood.
My son, I beg you to pray.
Gotta go to work.
Okay, now he starts to pray. This is one of those places where you see how awesome Hitchcock was as a director. Watch what happens. So an hour and 36 minutes into this movie, we meet the guilty party. And he goes into this store and tries to rob it. But this time, he gets caught in the act. And all of a sudden, Henry Fonda is a free man. The trial is no more. This weight is no longer hanging over his head. He is free. But man, it was close. An hour and 36 minutes you invest in this movie, and then all of a sudden there's a little glimmer of hope. But I love that shot, how this guy starts a block away and he walks right into Henry Fonda's face. That took a lot of planning. That was a cool shot. Well, so he's found innocent, he's released, he's free. He goes to the sanitarium where his wife is. She's still in her own world. She still won't communicate with him. And you think, oh man, that's it? And then there's one little slide that comes up on the screen that says, 2 years later, she walked out completely cured. Now, I don't know why Hitchcock didn't want to show us that. Maybe he wanted to sustain this grim mood for the whole movie, but there was a happy ending to the story. It just took a couple of years, but it happened just like he filmed it. So what do we learn from these stories of the wrong man? Well, we learned something that I think all of us are sort of aware of, that bad things can happen to good people. We all know that. In fact, sometimes it seems like they mostly happen to good people. But as I've written it, this is only half of the sentence. Bad things can happen to good people, but good people can rise above the bad things. You know, I had forgotten a lot of this movie. I was stunned when I rewatched it this week and saw Henry Fonda walk into his room, and there's a picture of Jesus on the wall, and he begins to pray. I had no idea that was even in there. I was going to do this movie even without remembering that. But that really brought it home to me. People who have faith to rely on can make it even through bad times. People that don't have any faith, I don't know how they make it. Many times they don't. But your faith can take you through times when you know you're the wrong man or the wrong woman, when you know that you're innocent, when you know that you're not at fault. Your faith can strengthen you when you know that you are not really alone, even though it may seem that way at times. One other major theme of Hitchcock's I want to cover in just a few minutes, this is a short one, has to do with what he called the MacGuffin. Anybody know what the MacGuffin is? Just you, Gary. You do, Darren? Okay. Lindsay, you know what the MacGuffin is? No. Well, the MacGuffin is something that Hitchcock seems to have made up, the concept of. It's been used many times since then. And I looked and looked because I wanted to find audio or video of him explaining what the MacGuffin was. It's a little technique he uses in a lot of his movies. And I found audio of him explaining it, but some young filmmaker just recently had taken that audio and made a cool little short film as Hitchcock explains what the MacGuffin is. So I'm just going to show you this little film that's just about 1.5 minutes long.
A MacGuffin you see in most films about spies. It is a thing that the spies are after. In the days of Rudyard Kipling, it would be the plans of the fort on the Khyber Pass. It would be the plans of an airplane engine and the plans of an atom bomb, anything you like. It's always called the thing that the characters on the screen worry about, but the audience don't care. And someone asked, what is a MacGuffin? And it's described in a scene in an English train going to Scotland. And one man says to the other opposite him, he said, what's that package above your head there? The other man said, oh, that's a MacGuffin. He said, what is a MacGuffin? He said, well, it's an apparatus for trapping lions in the Scottish Highlands. The man said, but there are no lions in the Scottish Highlands. He said, then that's no MacGuffin.
Now, that's kind of a Shaggy Dog joke. Could you understand it? The way Hitchcock tells the story, there's two guys on a train to Scotland, and one of them says, what's in that package up there? And the other guy says, it's a MacGuffin. And the first guy says, well, what is a MacGuffin? He said, well, it's an apparatus for trapping lions in the Scottish Highlands. The first guy said, there are no lions in the Scottish Highlands. And the guy says, well, then that's no MacGuffin. See, it's a stupid little joke. But that's the story he always told. But as he used the term, he said the MacGuffin is the thing in a movie that everybody is after. It seems to drive the plot forward. We looked last week at that shot from Notorious where Ingrid Bergman had to get the key to the wine cellar so that she and Cary Grant could find out what her Nazi husband was planning. And they go down to the wine cellar and accidentally break a bottle of wine, except it's not wine. It's full of sand. And in the sand is uranium. What for? Well, nobody knew when Hitchcock made the movie because there was no such thing as an atomic bomb. But he thought it sounded like a cool idea to use uranium as the MacGuffin in this movie. He was very surprised when the FBI came knocking on his door and said, what do you know about atom bombs? He said, I don't know anything. I said, well, where'd you get this uranium idea? It just seemed like an interesting idea. He very narrowly stumbled onto something that the government was trying its best to keep anybody from hearing about, that they were working at the time on the atom bomb. But Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman find uranium in a wine bottle. Is that important? No. What's important is that there's something that's making them do this. Another example I showed you last week, that chase scene on Mount Rushmore. Cary Grant's got that little statue. Inside that statue is microfilm. What's on that microfilm? We don't know. We never find out. But the whole movie is about trying to get that, and that's a MacGuffin. It doesn't really matter what it is. Just the fact that the director says it exists is enough to drive the plot. And Hitchcock would use MacGuffins over and over again. He wasn't the only one. This is not Hitchcock. The Maltese Falcon. What's special about that black bird statue? We don't know. It's a MacGuffin. Going back further to what is usually acclaimed as the greatest movie ever made, Citizen Kane. The whole movie is based on this billionaire whose last words are Rosebud. And a reporter spends a whole movie trying to find out what Rosebud is. And we know it's a sled he had when he was a kid. What's important about that? We never find out. The movie is not about the sled. It's about the search. It's about the journey. It's about the chase. The MacGuffin has not died out in recent years either. You seen Pulp Fiction? You remember the briefcase in Pulp Fiction that when they open it, something is glowing inside there and they say, oh, it's beautiful. What is that? It's a MacGuffin. It doesn't matter what is in that case. It serves its purpose as a plot device. And even more recently, did you see this movie? What was going on the planet where these blue people lived? There was people from Earth searching for a rare element. Guess what it's called? Unobtainium. Unobtainium. I don't know why they didn't use doesn't existium. It's the same thing. It's a MacGuffin. It means nothing, but it drives the story forward. Now, what does that have to do with us? What are some things that we use as MacGuffins? Well, first, let me give you the little lesson to hitch on to here, which is based on a horrible poem I wrote this week. The MacGuffin is nothing. It's true. And yet, sometimes we spend our whole lives chasing. Is that Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman end up together. It's not uranium in a wine bottle. Now, what are some MacGuffins that we use? Well, some things I thought of. Any one of these, a person can build his or her life around trying to attain. You know, some of them drive me crazy, like denominations. There are some people who worship their church. There are some people who worship the Bible. We're not supposed to worship the Bible. We're not supposed to worship the list of rules you learn when you grow up in a church, any more than we're supposed to worship any of these other things. These are all MacGuffins. These are all things that you can spend your life devoting your time to, and yet when you get to the end, what good are they? What good are they? I'll tell you, Brian Wilson has meant more to my life than any politician ever in any office. Beauty, love, grace, forgiveness, these are things that are real. These are treasures that are worth chasing after. Being loyal to your church is not serving God, necessarily. Memorizing the Bible is not living a Christian life, necessarily. They are MacGuffins. Well, keep that in mind. What did Mr. Hitchcock have to say about the future of entertainment, what it was going to be like?
Tell us, Mr. Hitchcock, how do you envision the theater of the future?
I see the possibility maybe in the year 3000 or something. The people go to be entertained if entertainment is still needed then. And they go into a big darkened auditorium. And they are mass hypnotized And instead of identifying themselves as somebody on the screen, they are that person. And when they buy their ticket, they choose which character they want to be. And under hypnotism, mass hypnotism, they go through the story, and it's injected into them by some kind of telepathy, and they suffer the agonies and so forth, or enjoy the romance with a woman or something, and then the lights go up and it's all over.
Would they...
Maybe it's Hitchcock's new conception of how to dispense with actors. Or because of what have I said once on one occasion, Walt Disney has the right answer where actors are concerned. If he doesn't like them, he tears them up.
Now, this is really interesting to me because I think he was prophetic here. You may say, well, movies are not like that. You ever play a video game? You ever play a video game on a big screen where you get to pick the character you are? And you can be a soldier or a cowboy or a superhero or a cartoon character, and you experience that movie. You are in that movie. Where you turn, the screen turns. When you encounter someone, it's you making the decisions. It's very prophetic what he has to say. He couldn't envision all the nuts and bolts of it, but it's already come true way ahead of the year 3000. Well, we got one more week to go. What are we going to talk about?
Story. Good night.
See you next time.